Hi class. Wolf Hollow, Chapter 7. The jewel weed worked, but not as quickly as it might have on a milder case, so I was happy with the day that followed. Betty stayed home recovering, and Andy was still fair weathering somewhere else. Mrs. Taylor opened the windows of the schoolhouse to let in the breeze and the sound of the birds, and I learned about a thing called onomatopoeia, which I could not yet spell, but practiced under my breath throughout the afternoon. The next morning, Betty and Andy both returned to school. Betty's face and hands still looked tender, a little scalded, but so much improved that I could hardly believe that she'd been so recently poisoned. Even so, she wore long sleeves and trousers and moved a little carefully as she came down the path into the schoolyard. I watched her from the schoolhouse steps, where I sat in the sunshine with Ruth and some of the other girls, waiting for Mrs. Taylor to call us in. "Hey, Betty," someone said. Betty stopped, then came closer, her lunch pail in her left hand. She looked straight at me, lifted her right hand, and squeezed it slowly into a fist. "Hey, Annabelle," she said with a smile. I hadn't expected any thanks for helping her get well, but I hadn't expected this either. How stupid I was. "Why are you so mean?" I asked, and I was really curious. I really wanted to know. "I'm just older than you, is all," she said. "You'll learn to look after your own self, too, if you're not too dumb, which you might well be." But I wasn't. Neither dumb nor too young to know what mean was. "Come on inside," Mrs. Taylor yelled or called. Only Betty stayed behind when the rest of us went in. When she did eventually appear, nearly an hour later, Andy was with her. He was newly browned from the sun, his clothes clean, and Betty, despite her trousers, looked all girl next to him. "I'm so glad you could finally join us," Mrs. Taylor said to Andy, "and I hope you're feeling better," she said to Betty. They took their seats, the lesson at the chalkboard resumed, and the rest of the morning passed quietly enough. Andy slept through a good deal of it. As he slept, Betty watched him, ignoring Mrs. Taylor's instructions. The book on her desk closed. When he woke, Betty smiled and tugged on his sleeve. He turned to her, grinned through a yawn, and sat up straighter in his chair. I thought about asking Mrs. Taylor if I could switch seats with someone so I wouldn't have to watch such moonshine, but I didn't want to abandon Ruth, and I seemed to be invisible to Betty as long as Andy was nearby. I didn't want to do anything to change that. I wanted nothing more of bruises and threats and poor dead quails. I wanted nothing to do with anyone who could close her hand around a bird's neck and smile about it. I wanted Betty to go back to where she had come from. I wanted to rewind the clock to where it had been before she arrived. I wanted to undo, to unremember, to be who I'd been before, someone who had never prayed for blisters, someone who had never even considered doing so. But if all I could have was a little respite from the attention, I would take it gladly. Andy drew her to him, away from me, and I would have to be satisfied with that. Recess for us was a matter of spilling out into the clearing around the schoolhouse twice each day to jump rope or play hopscotch or otherwise sow some oats. We weren't supposed to go near the road that led past the schoolhouse through the hollow, where one hill ended and another began, and we generally ignored the cars that traveled past from time to time. But whenever I heard a team of horses plodding by, pulling the hay wagon, or a flatbed, I'd stop what I was doing to walk alongside for a bit, chatting with the farmers or the horses, sometimes taking them a bucket of well water if they stopped to rest on a hot afternoon. On this day, Mr. Foss and his grays came slowly down the road, pulling a wagon full of fat apples and bushels and pecks on his way to the market. Mr. Foss was so friendly and kind that he'd always asked us to call him Mr. Ansell, which we did, though when Henry once called him called him Ansel without the mister, my mother cuffed him behind the ear. "Hi, Mr. Ansel," I called from the steps of the schoolhouse where Ruth and I were playing a game of cat's cradle, at which Mr. Ansel slowed the horses further and waved in reply. His good morning came out in Hoot Morgen, his tongue forever German, no matter how many years he'd lived in these hills. "And how are you, small Annabelle, smaller Ruth, on a morning as fine as this one?" He wore overalls that were Sunday clean and crisply pressed, a well-brushed hat and boots as polished as his apples, which gleamed in the sun as if he were carting them to a jeweler's for setting. "Just fine," I said. His horses stamped a little, eager to get going, but I leaned my forehead for a moment against the nearest haunch and patted it with my open hands. "I just wish I were going to market with you and these sweet boys. They're awfully nice." Ruth, her dark hair in a tight braid, her skirt straight and sharp, kept back a little, clear of their hooves and their big yellow teeth. Her father was a bookkeeper. The only animal at Ruth's house was a tabby cat. Later, everyone would wonder what Ruth had ever done to deserve what happened next. The rock that caught Ruth square in the eye was small enough so her brow did not deflect it, large enough that it knocked her on her back, and did her eye real hurt. That much was clear even to me as I watched the blood spill down her cheek. Ruth was stunned the way a bird is stunned when it flies into a window full of the sky reflected. She lay still, but her hands and feet twitched in the dust kicked up by her fall. I knew when Mr. Ansel leaped from the wagon seat and knelt next to Ruth. I knew when there was yelling and confusion in the schoolyard. I knew when Mrs. Taylor came racing into the road and saw Ruth's face and sped away again to fetch her car. I knew when Ruth came out of her stupor and began to scream. When Mr. Ansel scooped Ruth up into the back of Mrs. Taylor's Ford car, we both stood clear as she pulled into the road and away quickly, dust rising in her wake. "I will go as quickly as I can and tell her parents," Mr. Ansel said to me. There was a smear of blood on his perfectly clean coat. He climbed into the wagon and snapped the reins smartly. His horses, already upset, lurched into a trot. Behind the wagon, apples littered the road in a long, rolling trail that did not end until the road curved away. A fly had come to light on a spatter of Ruth's blood, and I watched it drinking. The other children were still lined up along the road, quiet. Henry and James came to stand with me. Henry, who never did what I told him, said, "What should we do?" Without Mrs. Taylor, we were all children now. Even the older boys, clustered behind the rest, looked small. I didn't see Andy. I didn't see Betty. At the time, I was glad they weren't around. That's all I thought about them at the time. I said, "Henry, run home and get someone." Ours was not the nearest house, but it's one where my mother was. When Henry took off, James followed, and I didn't call him back, which would have done me no good in any event. Then I fetched a pail of water at the well, poured it over the blood in the road, and went inside to wait. Some of the other children came along. Most collected their things and went home. The littlest ones sat in their desks with their hands folded until someone came to fetch them. I sat at my desk, which was so much bigger without Ruth, put down my head, and cried. I was waiting on the schoolhouse steps when my parents trundled down the road in our old truck and pulled up alongside the gully by the schoolhouse. They took me close to them for a moment before my mother went to be with the other children. My father bent to look me in the eye. "What happened, Annabelle?" I stopped crying, long before I ran out of tears, so they threatened now to start again. I don't know, I said. I was standing just there. I turned to point, talking to Mr. Ansell. Ruth was a little behind me, scared of the grays, the horses, and then a rock hit her right here. I tapped my left eyelid, and she fell down. Mrs. Taylor took Ruth away in her car. My father straightened to look past me and the truck at the road and the hill that rose up behind it. "Show me," he said. So I walked around the truck and into the road. There was still a wet spot where I'd washed away Ruth's blood. "Here," I said. "This is where Ruth was standing." "Facing the hill?" Mr. Ansell was headed down the hollow. "Yes, to the market. See the apples there? From how fast he went to tell Ruth's mother. Yes, she was standing there, and I was here," I said, moving to where I'd been. "And the horses right in front of me, and the wagon and Mr. Ansell here." I sketched a box with my hand. "So the rock came from the hillside there?" I looked up at the facing hill. It was steep, trees and bushes rooted everywhere they could root, ledges of slate all over the place, the gully below littered with fallen bits. "It must have, I guess, since that's where Ruth was facing." My father stood with his hands on his hips, considering the hillside. "So the wagon and the horses and you were all in between Ruth and the hill," he said. I nodded. "That's right." "Which means the rock couldn't have just fallen loose and bounced out of the gully, or it would have hit the horses or the wagon before it hit Ruth," he said thoughtfully. "It had to have come down from higher up to clear all of you and hit her." It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer it. Far as I knew, no one had climbed that hill at recess, though the boys sometimes played King of the Mountain when school was over, grabbing hold of branches as they climbed, gaining footholds on the ledges and along the trunks of the trees. Rabbits and deer and boys had made zigzag paths that showed the easiest ways up and down. "And you didn't see anyone up there when this happened?" I shook my head. "I was looking at the horses and Mr. Ansell, and then I was looking at Ruth." And that was when my lips began to tremble. "Okay, Annabelle," my father said, his hand on my head. "It's okay. We don't have to talk about this right now." But he turned and looked up the hill again, and I knew there would be more to come.